It took me a while to post this story. I've never shared it with anyone before, but it's been hard keeping this bottled up. I need to tell someone, so I figured why not do it anonymously over the internet. About 3 years ago, I was looking for work right after graduating my first 2 years of college. The job pool wasn't very motivating. I tried applying at all of the average places. Walmart, a local video store, GameStop, the mall. I almost even applied at McDonald's. I was desperate for cash. One of my older friends who had moved to the next city over called me up to chat. And when I told him about how the job hunt was going, he suggested that I work for the security firm that he had been working for before the move. The pay's pretty good, and mainly, all you gotta do is sit on your butt all night and glance over at cameras every now and again, he told me. They're basically paying you to listen to music and watch Netflix on your phone for 6 hours a night. I wasn't too sure, but I promised him that I would look into it. Not much left, but hey, getting paid more than $15 an hour for barely anything sounded like a pretty good deal. On Monday, I called the number that I had looked up in the paper. I talked to a guy called John Dorner, who was apparently the guy giving out the job. He sounded pleased to hear from me. I got the impression that he hadn't gotten many or any offers to work from midnight to 6 a.m. He told me to come down as soon as I could, so I hopped in my car and I went. We did the interview in an office downtown with the company's name on it. Lobachek Security. On the phone, John had given the impression of some big jolly Santa type guy. So I was surprised when I came into his office and met this trim young man who couldn't have been more than in his late 20s or early 30s. He looked like the type of guy you would see on ESPN, with a square jaw, white teeth, commanding eyes, wide shoulders, and carefully combed hair. Anyway, John interviewed me, and it was honestly one of the easiest interviews that I've ever had in my life. He had me do a few physical displays, like showing that I could do a certain amount of push-ups and stuff without getting winded. All they needed really was a physical from my doctor and to get my background check back, and we would be done and I would be good to go. Though there wasn't any danger of either of those things losing me the position as I had told him. It was just formalities. He ran over the details of my position with me and told me basically what the job would entail. I would be sitting at a security gate all night making sure that nobody was breaking in. I would have to keep an eye on the camera feeds, and every hour or so I would need to walk the perimeter of the compound to make sure that everything was above board. Easy stuff. By 6 a.m., the morning shift would start and the next guy would come and take over. He also fed me the whole spiel about how I was expected to be responsible because I was going to be working under the Lobachek name, and since that he was the one hiring me, it would look bad for him if I did something wrong and blah blah blah. Basically if you're gonna mess around on the job, make sure it doesn't come back to bite me in the butt. That kind of talk. With all that said and done, I got up to leave and John extended his hand. I took it, but dang, his hand was like a catcher's mitt. He shook my hand and looked me in the eye with a huge grin on his face and said, "Welcome to the team." About a week later, once my physical and background check had passed, John called me back down to the office to get my security outfit and told me to go down to the compound by 9 p.m. And this was so the evening shift guy could give me the rundown on where everything was and what I should do in case of this or that. The compound was just some factory for machine parts, like construction vehicles and tractors and stuff like that. When I had heard the word compound, I had been imagining some sort of goofy sci-fi secret lab or something, but I guess not being kidnapped and experimented on was a heck of a lot better. The thing is, the place was a good half-an-hour drive out into the middle of scenic nowhere. I'm talking the boondocks behind the boondocks. I hadn't even seen a farmhouse for more than a mile before I got there. There were no trees, just a few shrubs and some long brush. Everything around the compound was flat dirt. I guess so visibility would be good. I met up with the evening shift guy. Apparently 9 p.m. was when the place closed down for the night, and the last few workers were leaving as I pulled in. I guess he hadn't been expecting me, but he just shrugged. I guess the information hadn't been relayed to him. No big deal though. I was used to past bosses not communicating well at all. The guy seemed okay, but he didn't look much older than me, maybe 25. I'll call him Seth, and I instantly knew that me and him would get along when his first words to me were, "This place has open Wi-Fi," with a smirk on his face. Seth showed me the setup in the guard box, the controls to operate the gate and the different camera feeds, and then we went out to walk the compound for the first time. So at 9 p.m. the perimeter alarm turns on and the alarm will go off whenever anything hits the fence. What, like people? Nah, mainly just raccoons, possums, squirrels. Mainly. Well yeah, sometimes we'll get a couple of coyotes and maybe a deer every now and then. Nothing to worry about really. Barbed wire keeps most of the bigger stuff from crawling over, like raccoons. Am I gonna need to run out here to chase off raccoons all the time? I asked him. Nah, if you can see on the camera that's what's setting off the perimeter alarm, you don't need to bother. I mean, technically we're supposed to, but after you have to run about 300 yards to the northeast corner just to spot a rabbit or something, it gets old pretty quick. If I can spot it on the camera, I just leave it alone. Haven't had any problems so far. Never had anybody actually try getting in. Seth laughed. Dude, we're out in the middle of nowhere guarding a place where they build farm equipment. Not really anything worthwhile for somebody to come and steal. He stopped for a second and then added, "Oh, and Sawyer." Sawyer? He's the guard cat, Seth said. One of the guys who used to run security here found him out in the yard one night and brought him back. He's basically everybody's pet here. He might set off the alarm once or twice a week if he's going after a field mouse or something. Just let him come and go, nobody really cares. We walked around the rest of the compound and Seth showed me where every camera was at. It was a decent size, taking us a little more than 10 minutes to make our way back around the factory to the guard box at the front gate. Seth told me that all I really needed to do when I came out every couple of hours was to make sure that nobody was in here. Something not really hard. I mean, what would they do? Tunnel underneath the fence. And to make sure that there were no breaches in the fence where somebody might be able to get in. Basically, just go for a little walk every now and then and get some fresh air, he joked. Seth and I sat in the guard box for the next couple of hours until his shift ended and mine began, just shooting the shit. At one point, a scruffy-looking brown cat came waltzing in and brushed up against my legs. I reached down to pet him, and that's when I noticed it had something in its mouth. And I drew my hand back so fast that I almost hit myself in the face. "Hey, it looks like Tom Sawyer brought you a little welcoming gift." Seth laughed. It was the biggest rat that I had seen in my life. Like this thing could probably pass off as a chihuahua in the right light. What was worse is that it wasn't dead. Sawyer had ripped the thing open from the throat to the crotch where he had it in his fangs, and its guts were hanging out, but the rat was still squirming weakly in his mouth. I was glad that I hadn't just eaten dinner. Seth grabbed Sawyer by the scruff of his neck like a mother cat and gave him a little shake over the trash bin until he dropped the creature into the garbage, and then he stepped outside and pitched it over the fence into the dirt. When he came in and sat back down and saw my disgusted face, he smiled. "Yeah, Sawyer will do that from time to time. He brings you little presents like that to show that he likes you. Just toss him and something will come by later and get it." He scratched the cat between the ears and it cuddled up next to his feet, looking up at me, almost like it was waiting for me to say thank you. About an hour later, Seth finally left and I was on my own with Sawyer as my only company for the next 6 hours. Now I'm sure this is the part where you would expect for shit to suddenly hit the fan. Well, sorry to disappoint, but it didn't. Everything went fine. In fact, the alarm never even went off that night. For the next week, it was like that. I would sit in my box watching videos on my phone or texting, whatever, and Sawyer would either be curled up near my feet, out hunting, or just wandering in general. The perimeter alarm was set off a few times, but it was only ever a squirrel or a possum like Seth had said, or a Sawyer out prowling around. Sawyer was even kind enough to bring me one of the squirrels one night, gutted just like the rat that he had brought me the first night, and I patted him on the head and tossed it over the fence, just like Seth had said. Seth had been right. Some animals came by at some point and took the remains away when I wasn't paying attention. It went on like this for about another week, and that's when shit started getting kind of weird. One night, I was sitting in the guard box playing on my phone when the alarm went off for the southwest fence. I looked at the camera, but I couldn't see anything. I gave it a couple of minutes, but when nothing popped up on the feed that could have set the alarm, I grumbled and got to my feet, clicked on my flashlight, and stepped out to go and check it out. "Sawyer, you keep an eye out for anything suspicious," I joked as I left the box. Sawyer just raised his head and gave me a smug cat look as if to say, "I'm the only one who does any real work around here." It was pitch black out there in the yard surrounding the compound. It was cloudy that night, so there was no light from the moon. There were lampposts along the fence, but they were so few and far between that I would be walking in total darkness for a good 2 minutes before reaching the next one. I waved my flashlight around slowly, not wanting to wind up getting attacked by a raccoon or something by tripping over it in the dark. And that's when I heard it. The fence rattled in the dark like something was climbing on it. I waved my flashlight along it and came to the part of the fence that was still shaking back and forth. There was nothing there. I scanned the dark portion of the yard with a wide sweep of my light, but whatever had been on the fence must have dodged the heck out of there when it heard me coming. I shrugged and muttered, "Raccoons," and I turned to head back to the guard box. But that's when something else caught my ear. A really low and soft growl. It sounded kind of like a dog but didn't have quite the right inflection to it. Kind of like someone was pretending to be a dog. Either way, I nearly pissed my drawers and whipped around, holding the flashlight in front of me and shined it all along the fence. The light went pretty far, but it didn't matter. Whatever it was hiding out in the brush about 10 yards from the fence. So naturally, I bent over and picked up a rock off the ground and chucked it as hard as I could in the direction that I thought the noise had come from. Whatever it was, it must have gotten spooked, because I could hear something go crashing through the brush away from the fence and into the night. I shuddered a bit, backing away a few steps from the fence, and then I felt like a huge baby. Seth had told me that there were coyotes that came around here sometimes. I had even heard them whining out there in the fields a few times the past week. What was I afraid of? Coyotes were super scared of people, and besides, I had a huge chain-link fence separating it from me. I sighed and smirked at my own cowardice and then turned and headed back to the guard box. The one thing that I couldn't get out of my mind, though, was a single thought. Could coyotes climb fences? The next few nights were pretty uneventful. Sawyer brought me a young baby rabbit whose head had ripped off, and I pitched it over the fence like always. Then Thursday night rolled around. It had to be around 2 a.m. when the alarm jolted me awake. I guess I had leaned back in my chair and dozed off for a little while. I looked at the camera, and for a change, I could actually see a coyote this time, pressed up against the fence on the east side. I sat there and watched it for a minute, but it didn't seem like it planned on moving anytime soon. I wasn't about to sit there and listen to this high-pitched buzzing until the dumb animal decided it was going to screw off back into the field. So I took my flashlight and headed out. But almost as soon as I had left my box, the alarm shut off. I stopped and looked back. I went back into the box and looked at the feed, and the coyote was gone. Lucky me, or so I had thought. until I heard a high-pitched animal shriek from outside. It sounded like a dog yowling in pain. Sawyer immediately sat up and backed into a corner, letting out a low, agitated sound. He didn't like that sound. This cat had slept through pretty much every alarm since I had started this job, but this sound made his fur stand on end, and he scrunched himself up in the far corner of the guard box. I had guessed that it must be the coyote. I figured maybe it was fighting with another member of its pack, but then it just kept on going and it was even worse than the alarm. I couldn't see anything on the feed, so I figured that I would head out and yell at them and toss a few rocks until they left and I could get some peace and quiet. But I wish I hadn't. As I made my way out to the eastern fence, the wailing became more and more piercing, almost agonized. When I was drawing up within about 20 yards from that point in the fence, it suddenly dropped, almost dead quiet. It was like somebody had hit a mute button. I don't know why, maybe it was because I knew the thing must have died, but my mouth was suddenly really dry, and my entire body tensed up for a second. I scanned along the fence and my light illuminated two small orbs near the brush. My culprit. "Go on, get out of here," I shouted. It didn't even move an inch. I bent over, picked up a few rocks, and chucked them all at the animal. Something ran away in the brush, but the coyote's eyes were still staring back at me. I squinted and approached the fence closer, getting right up on it until my nose was practically touching the metal. That was a mistake. I wasn't looking at a coyote, not a full one anyway. The top half of it was lying in the dirt around the fence, looking directly at me, but at its midsection it just ended. Its intestines were trailing behind its top half, back to the edge of the brush, disappearing into the tall grass. I gagged. I stumbled back and turned my eyes away, not wanting to look anymore but not being able to help myself. It was like morbid curiosity. I trailed my flashlight down and could see drag marks in the dirt leading from the fence. Something had grabbed this animal, dragged it away from the fence, and began tearing into it about halfway to the grass, if the trail of blood was any indication. I had heard that coyotes were cannibalistic, but this was not what I had been expecting to find. This wasn't just some dominance dispute. It was brutal. And that's when I heard a very soft whimper, and I looked back at the coyote. It was still alive. I don't know how, given that practically all of its insides were outsides now, but it was lying there weakly pawing at the ground, like it was still trying to get back to the perceived safety of the fence. It dragged its entrails behind it as it inched forward. I covered my mouth. I didn't want to watch. Seeing anything in pain like this was just wrong in my mind, but it was so surreal that I couldn't help myself. It reminded me of the animals that Sawyer always brought in. All at once, I heard a snarl and then the coyote's intestines went taut, and I watched in horror as the rest of the animal was dragged by its own living guts back into the brush and disappearing completely from view. And then it was quiet. There was no final yelp, no growl or movement. Everything was just still and quiet. "Oh, screw that," I said out loud, and turned abruptly and jogged my butt back to the guard box. I came back in and Sawyer was still scrunched up in the corner. I sat down and swiveled my chair to face out of the box. There was no door. I just stared outside along the southern fence, along the spaced-out lampposts, all the way to the eastern corner, disappearing along the side of the factory. I didn't feel safe. I looked over at Sawyer and I guess I was maybe trying to cope with the messed up stuff that I had just seen, but I said to him, "Yeah, $15 an hour ain't enough to deal with freaking werewolves or chupacabras or whatever that was, man." Sawyer looked up at me and let out that same agitated noise that he had made earlier, as if he was agreeing with me. I didn't get back on my phone for the rest of the night. Sawyer and I just sat there near the back of the guard box, staring out into the dark. And the alarm didn't go off again. Once the morning guy showed up to take over, I told him what had happened last night, and he went with me to see. The blood was gone. It was like somebody had come by and just sucked it up with a carpet shampooer or something. I swore up and down that what I was saying was the truth, but the guy just told me that I must have had a nightmare, and that he would let it slide and wouldn't tell the boss if I was falling asleep on the job, but to not let it happen again. That night, I told Seth about what had happened. He also didn't sound very impressed. Dude, I mean, we do have cougars around these parts. It's nature being nature, he said, not really focusing on me and scratching Sawyer's back. I'm telling you, it's like something out of a horror movie, I stammered, taking a quick glance over my shoulder. It dragged it into the darkness and that was it. And they were never heard from again type stuff. You've got Mace, Seth said. You think Mace is gonna stop a mountain lion? I mean, are you sure that you didn't fall asleep? I didn't fall asleep. I was getting pretty pissed off. Okay, I just mean, what the hell happened with all that blood you said you saw then? I don't know. It was like somebody had come by and swept away all the blood-stained dirt along the fence, along with any evidence that my story had. I don't know, dude, something just isn't sitting right with me. I'm not sure that I want to keep doing this. Oh, don't quit just because some coyotes were getting antsy, Seth said, putting Sawyer down. Look, what if I stick around for a little while with you? If any weird shit happens, then I'll be able to back you up on it. Won't you get into trouble for that? I asked. Seth only shrugged. As far as I'm concerned, if it ain't on company time and you're here, what the heck are they going to complain about? Seth stuck around for about 3 hours. Absolutely nothing happened. About 2:45, Sawyer came waltzing into the guard box with a half-dead squirrel. Seth pitched it over the fence like usual. We went out a few minutes later to walk the perimeter again, and when we got back to the guard box, Seth finally decided that he had had enough. I mean, I couldn't blame him. Now I looked like I was just being a huge baby. But that's when we noticed Sawyer, scrunched into the back of the guard box, making that low grumbling noise that he had made the other night with the coyote. What's wrong with you, Tom Sawyer? Seth asked, bending down to pet the cat. Is old Joe out there killing coyotes? Tom bit Seth on the hand and then fled out of the guard box. Ow, what was that for? He cried, grabbing his hand. Stupid cat, the heck's wrong with him? He was acting this way the other night too, I said, now on full alert for any sounds. We stood there in the guard box, me scanning the darkness and Seth taking care of his hand with the first aid kit. When the alarm went off, my heart practically jumped into my throat. You see anything on the cameras? I asked, not willing to look away from the door. Seth didn't say anything for a second, and then I heard him mutter, What the hell? I glanced over my shoulder but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Seth stood up. Come on, he said, walking out of the box. I followed behind him. As I stepped out of the guard box, something squishy crunched beneath my foot. I looked down. Duh, it's that squirrel, I said, dragging my foot through the dirt. I thought you pitched it over the fence. I did. Sawyer must have brought it back in. We went all the way to the northern fence in the very back of the compound. I asked Seth what he had seen, but he just told me to keep quiet. We were coming up on the northwest corner when Seth stopped, shining his flashlight on the fence. My stomach turned over. The fence had been peeled back near the top, like something big had crashed into it and bent the links out of place. There was a bit of blood on the fence. Whatever it was hadn't quite cleared the barbed wire. Seth, what the hell? I asked, getting increasingly uneasy. He shined his light along the ground. there was a trail of speckles of blood going along the ground down and around the western side of the compound. Not disemboweled corpse being dragged trail, but more like stabbed teenager fleeing from Jason. "We need to find out what the heck is in here," he whispered, his voice quivering. Before I could say anything, he began walking down and around the corner. We walked down the western fence in silence, straining our eyes and ears to hear anything. Seth was keeping his flashlight ahead of us, pointed at the ground so that he could see the trail, when we heard a loud, huffing sound. Seth nearly jumped out of his skin and swung the flashlight around frantically, giving us flashes of something in the dark about 20 feet ahead of us. I raised my own flashlight to look into the terrified eyes of a young buck. "Oh, Jesus Christ," Seth wheezed. I breathed a sigh of relief. It was a deer. I almost wanted to laugh until I started taking in the whole animal. The buck's neck had been cut open. A large chunk of its throat was simply hanging off its body, and blood was slowly dripping from the wound, pooling on the ground at its feet. Its legs and stomach were all cut up too, probably from the barbed wire. "Oh, Jesus Christ," Seth wheezed again. "Something attacked it," I whispered. "It tried to make it over the fence. It thought that it would be safe here." "It's gotta be a mountain lion," he whispered, now just as on edge as me. A coyote couldn't do that, not to a good-sized buck. Suddenly the animal froze, its breathing stopped, and its ears swiveled back and forth. It turned sharply and bounded right past us and over the fence again, getting its back legs caught in the barbed wire and ripping a portion of it down off the fence. It kicked frantically until it freed its back legs and charged off into the dark. We both looked at one another and then walked down the western fence the rest of the way back to the guard box. But the night wasn't over yet. When we got back to the box and Seth sat down in the chair, I stood with my back against the far wall looking out the doorway. The squirrel was gone. I guess that Sawyer must have taken it. "Dude, this isn't what I was told the job would be like. Nobody said anything about a mountain lion, bro," I said in a hushed tone. I don't know if I was afraid something would hear me or what. "This kind of stuff never happened on my watch," Seth said. "I've never even seen hide nor hair of any cougars out here. Why wouldn't they give us a gun or something?" I was kind of pissed off. I mean, what was Mace going to do to a mountain lion? Piss it off even more while it mauled us to death. "I'm calling John," I said finally, taking out my phone. "John?" Seth tilted his head a bit. "Yeah, this job isn't worth having a tussle with a mountain lion." "Who's John?" "John, you know, the manager guy or whatever you call him. He never told me anything about mountain lions." I hit John in the contacts and held the phone up to my ear. "We're sorry, the number you have dialed is either disconnected or is no longer in service." You've got to be kidding me. I almost threw my phone outside. "What the hell, John?" "Dude, there's nobody named John that works with us," Seth piped up. "It's me in the evening, you for midnight, Tony on the morning shift, and Michael on the afternoon. The guy who runs this is named Jeremy." "No," I said adamantly. "John is the one who interviewed me. He's the one that hired me, John Dorner. I'm telling you, there's no John Dorner working with us. I don't know who the heck you talk to, but they definitely aren't with Canton Security." "Canton?" "Yes?" Something wasn't right, that was obvious. My pulse started to quicken, my throat was dry, and I began to sweat. Not Lobo Check Security." "Lobo what?" "We work with Canton Security, man, Jeremy Canton. Never even heard of what you're talking about." I tried my phone again, and I put in John's number myself this time. Still the same message. "We're sorry, the number you have dialed is either disconnected or is no longer in service." I looked down at my phone. My mind was a total blank. I slowly looked up at Seth. "Well then who was I?" The sound was so sudden and ear-splitting that I dropped my phone and Seth and nearly fell out of his chair. Somewhere outside of the front gate, a cat was screaming. "Oh, Jesus Christ, Sawyer," Seth yelled, scrambling to his feet and leaning outside. "Hit the gate," he said, and rounded the outside of the guard box. The gate slid open and Seth went out about halfway to the brush with his flashlight, scanning it for Sawyer. Suddenly, the noise stopped. I couldn't hear anything but my own racing pulse beating in my ears. Seth called out to Sawyer, trying to call him in, but there was nothing. After a minute, he began to slowly back up to the gate. And that's when I saw something out of the corner of my eye come flying out of the grass. It smashed into the window with a loud bang only a few feet away from Seth, and he shouted and stumbled backward. If I hadn't been leaning against the wall, I would have tripped up too. There was a trickle of blood running down the front of the window. I called out to Seth, and all I heard was a sob in response. I cautiously made my way out and crept around the back of the guard box and came up behind Seth. He was frozen, looking over at what had hit the window. I'm sure you can guess what it was. I don't want to go into detail. "I'm done," Seth shouted, frantically crawling up to his feet and sprinting for his car. I didn't need any encouragement to follow him. He wrestled with his keys for a moment and I urged him to hurry up, looking all around us, listening. When the grass a few yards away began to rustle, I swear to God I thought that I was going to faint. Seth got his door open, jumped in and slammed it shut, unlocked my side and did the same. He put the keys in the ignition and nothing. "Wait, come on," he shouted, slamming his fist on the wheel. "What the hell?" Something rushed from the grass and slammed up against the car. We both screamed, and I screamed even louder when I saw what it was. There, staring at me from Seth's window, was the guy that I had known as John Dorner. This time, however, his eyes were manic and bloodshot, and his hair was a wild mess. He was caked in a bit of fur and blood. His teeth were coated in dried blood, and drool was running down his face. He was breathing hard, fogging up the window. He tapped on the window with a blood-clotted knife that he had in his hand, and then let out a joyful, depraved-sounded sigh that turned into a giggle. "It's John," he breathed in a sing-song tone. "Here to check on you." Neither of us could speak. I couldn't breathe. John crouched down and made his way over near the guard box, crawling on all fours like some wacko Tarzan. I didn't want to turn around. I could see what he was doing in the rearview mirror though. He was eating. Oh, Jesus Christ. He came back over carrying something that he had mashed him against the window and smeared it all over, and then he started licking the window clean. "So good. Best thing I've eaten all night." Seth was crying. I'm pretty sure that I was too. I can't really remember what happened after that. I think my mind might have temporarily just shut off. What I can recall, the guy just sort of vanished back into the brush. Seth and I sat in his car for the next 3 hours. We didn't talk, we didn't move a single muscle. We were too afraid that he would come back. When Tony, the morning guy, came to relieve me, he found us both completely freaked out of our minds. When we called the cops shortly after, they looked around the area and the fields surrounding the compound. Other than finding dozens of mutilated animal corpses, there was no sign of this supposed crazy mystery man. Tony thought that we had been up all night doing drugs. When everything came to light, it turns out that I had never actually been hired by anyone. Nobody, I guess, brought me starting here up to that Canton guy, and when he heard my name, he said that he had never spoken to me before in my life. The police reviewed the security tapes, but the tapes cut out before 3 a.m. It seemed as though a frayed wire was to blame. Just poor wiring, they said. Poor wiring. The police told me that John Dorner was the name of a man who had died in the 1960s. There was no such business as a Lobo Check Security. and when the police investigated the office that I had visited, it was registered as having been on the market for more than 4 years. Not a single trace was left that this guy even existed. The police said to call them if anything else were to happen, but they literally had nothing but the word of 2 mentally unstable 20-somethings to go on, and it seemed pretty clear that they didn't really believe us. I tried calling my friend who told me about the job, but he never answered any of my calls or messages. I haven't heard from him since. Seth quit after that night, and I would have too had I actually been working there. For more than a month after that, I didn't sleep through the night. I barely slept at all. Every single noise that I heard was not John. Every single electronic noise was the alarm for the fence, telling me that he had come back to get me. For about a year after that, Seth and I kept in touch, calling one another now and again, and then even less frequently. Then for over a year we didn't speak at all. I don't think either of us really wanted to be reminded of that night. I've chosen to tell you this story because last week I get a voice message from Seth's number, only there wasn't a message. Just noises, like someone chewing with their mouth open.